Ghostbusters Afterlife was directed by Jason Reitman and is actually a sequel to the two movies that came out in the 80s, which is kind of wild to think about. I remember for the longest time they talked about making a third film, but it just never took off the ground. Something or the other kept happening, and then, unfortunately, with the passing of Harold Ramis, it became one of those things that just would never quite come to be. But lo and behold, we're actually getting a third one now, and it's now in theaters. You can go see it right now. In this movie, a small town in Oklahoma is getting some strange rumblings, and there are things that are happening which seem very strange and out of the blue. In this particular scenario, a bunch of new characters essentially take on the role of the Ghostbusters this time around, led by Phoebe Spengler, played by McKenna Grace, who is Egon Spengler's granddaughter. And essentially, they're trying to stop this threat from becoming something which is really, really terrible and destroying the entire town, and maybe expanding to something else that destroys the world. So now they have to come together and do that, along with a few things that they found from the previous Ghostbusters time. It is hard to talk about a film like Ghostbusters without referencing just how much of an impact it's had on pop culture. It's one of the biggest movies in just that regard, of how much its legacy has carried forward over the last 37 or so years since it first came out, and to this day, it's considered one of the more staple pop culture fan movies that you have to see. And so, going into this movie, there's going to be some hype. There will be a lot of fans from that generation who will be very excited to see where the story would go from when they left off with part 2 in, I believe, 89. And then on that note, you also have to consider that this is coming out so many years later. There are a new generation of fans who are ready to be, like go to a theater and watch Ghostbusters for the first time. So you have to sort of take that into effect too. So you're creating a sort of bridge, and the result is mostly fun. There are things about it that I think could have been better, but I can't say that I had a bad time in the theater. I think it's a very enjoyable movie. There are a lot of things to like about it. In particular, the performances. I think everybody does a really good job. The real standout over here being McKenna Grace. I think she's fantastic. One of the best young actresses that we have today, and I can't wait to see where her career goes. She's a really remarkable talent, and what she does in this film too is carry most of it, because you're following her for so long. Yes, you have other characters like Finn Wolfhard and Carrie Coon and Paul Rudd, but essentially the focus is on her for like 80% of the film. She helps bring forward the other performances just as well. Everybody in the film really does a good job. It's also a very fast and enjoyable film. Like, you will have a good time watching it on its own regard. It's a very entertaining movie. It never loses you for a second. Once the action eventually kicks in with the ghosts, it's pretty fun stuff, and there are a lot of references, of course. We'll talk more about the references later. I want to take some more time to discuss that. All of that stuff is really well handled. It's got a very original score, like it sounds a lot like the first Ghostbusters movie, and you can clearly tell that bridges have been, formed to bring all of those motifs together. And they've done a pretty good job of those things, which really taps into the point that I was making earlier about the film being a bit of both. It's trying to be a film that is able to honor what's come before it, but it's also trying to be a film that becomes something for the newer generation of fans who are sitting in the audience and watching this movie. And so it's trying to be a little something for everybody. And I think for the most part, the film does work on those levels. The direction by Reitman is really good. He is definitely following in his father's footsteps. He captures the tone and essence of it really, really well. And it never ceases to be anything but that. Like, it really feels like at its core DNA, this is a Ghostbusters movie. There are very solid character moments that are there throughout the entire film that really do keep it rooted. I have to say, I was going into this movie with some surprisingly low expectations. I had no idea what to expect from it. So I was pretty surprised by the fact that I was enjoying myself for the most part. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, that being the fan service. A lot of people have brought up their comments on that, and so, well, here's the thing. Fan service is finicky, because sometimes you can do a really good job of having things in there that make sense and they add to the plot, but sometimes you can be a little too over-reliant on them and have stuff in there because, well, it's another movie in this series. We may as well just throw in some familiar imagery so that fans can be satisfied. And so you have to sort of understand what works as just a moment where you go, hey, look at that thing. And there's moments which add to something. They enhance something. I think Ghostbusters Afterlife has both. There are things that are enhanced because of some things that they reference, but there are also things that are there solely for the reason of, look at that thing. You remember that thing? That was that thing. That was from the movie. You remember? You remember from the first one? Yeah, you remember? You remember? That's where the problems lie. And the criticisms that I've been seeing regarding the fan service, they're not as bad as some of the comments I've seen, but it's also in the way that if you remove them, it falls apart. That is where the issue lies for me. Because if a film needs fan service to keep itself together, that can be an issue. And that can really make things messy. So there are moments in this that feel like they're relying solely on the fact that that thing from the first movie exists right now. And that's happening at the moment, so that will really help. And so that's unfortunate. There are other moments in it with fan service that I think worked fine. But when it gets a little too familiar and when it tries to eventually, mess up the storytelling that's on display, that's where I think the film can run into some issues. And unfortunately, Ghostbusters Afterlife does have that particular flaw. But that being said, if you're a massive Ghostbusters fan and if you want to go into this expecting a lot of that stuff, you're gonna love this movie because this really hits every single note you wanted to in terms of fan service. I mean, everything's in here. Everything. And if you wanted to, think, oh, what else could they do if they go in a step further or something like that? No spoilers, but you get stuff. Like, as a fan movie, I think, as a Ghostbusters fan especially, you'll be very satisfied with this film. However, I found myself sort of going on and off in terms of the fan service stuff. I'm sorry it took so long talking about that, but it is such a major point of the movie that it's hard to talk about the rest of it without addressing the fact that so much of it is rooted in it. But that being said, I think it's still a very entertaining movie, one that could have been a little bit better, but overall, I still walked out thinking that was fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing it again. I think it's a very fun popcorn movie that could have been better. I think it could have been a little less overfamiliar and a little too over-reliant on fan service would have been probably a better thing, but overall, I still had a blast with it. I'm gonna give Ghostbusters Afterlife a 7 out of 10. Guys, thank you very much for watching, and there are so many things that are dropping this weekend and over the next couple of weeks. There are going to be a lot of reviews, there's going to be a lot of stuff to talk about. I'm going to try my best to cover all of it, so please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so we can talk about those things collectively. And as always, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys at the movies.